Well, good afternoon. It's great to see you. Welcome to this lunchtime charity catch up with Burton Suite. We're really delighted that you've been able to join us. Whether this is your first time at one of these events, whether actually you're with us every time, we're really pleased to see you. Lots of familiar faces and names with us, and we're really glad you're here. My name is Ed Marsh. I'm head of charity development at Burton Suite, and I'm here with my colleague Cecile Gillard, who is charities legal manager. And firstly, just want to give our apologies. There's this, I know that some people received some incorrect Zoom details for the meeting today. We're delighted you made it. The fact that you're here means that you've managed to be here successfully, but sorry for any hassle you've experienced in accessing the meeting. But I'm sure there'll be some people joining us shortly as well. But, you know, we do these events because we are really passionate about serving the charity sector. We're really keen to serve you in the work that you're doing, and we really appreciate the work that you're doing in serving the sector. And you know what these short charity catch-up events are all about is actually how can we provide for you some information that it's informative, it's interesting, it's something that equips you to be asking the right questions and equipping you to be thinking about the right things as you go about running your charity with more confidence. So we're looking forward to exploring that together. And our event today will last about an hour, so we'll be done by 1 o'clock. And we're going to spend the first half of that. Cecile and I are going to share some content and some updates and share some slides with you. And then there'll be an opportunity for Q&A as the last part of our time together. Just a couple of practicalities before we start. Given we've got quite a lot of people on the call today, so what we've done is kept you on mute for now, particularly for the presentational elements of our time together. But we will, during our second part with the Q&A, what we're hoping to do this time is give people the opportunity to come on screen and ask their question in person. Or you can ask a question in the chat. And I know also we've had a question submitted in advance of the event as well. So we'll be looking forward to addressing those together. Please feel very free to switch your camera on or to have your camera off. We just want you to feel relaxed here today. Do use the chat as well to share any sort of comments or any resources you come across. You know, what I always learn something from these events, despite the fact that I kind of end up doing most of the talking, because actually people take a chance to share in the chat their own experiences and share a bit of some resources that they found that might be useful to the topics we're going through. So please do that. We'd love to hear from you. Just to say, we're recording the event today. And we're doing that particularly so that you can have a copy of the recording afterwards to revisit anything that you kind of felt like, oh, I'd like to go back to that. And so we'll be making a recording that available only to those people that have signed up for the event today. And also we'll be sending out a copy of the slides as well after the event so that you can sort of digest things in a little bit more detail. Our content today is shaped by your suggestions. Last time we had one of these events a month ago, we asked for some feedback and we asked you to share with us what you'd like to be covered in future events. So that's what our agenda is today, is picking up on some of those events. In fact, let's just let me just show you what is on our agenda today. We are talking a bit about pursuing good governance. We're thinking a bit about some of the upcoming charity law changes. This is something we've slipped in at fairly late notice. The responsible investments consultation is just recently out, and actually we need to, as charities, be thinking about this in the context of our own charity assets and our own objectives. We're going to be talking a bit about sensible risk management. What I mean by sensible risk management is risk management that's practical. It's based in reality. It's not some kind of theoretical exercise. And we're just going to share some thoughts with you about that. And then I'm going to share just some news with you on the future and the direction of charity accounting and reporting before we head into Q&A. But without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Cecile, who's going to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Ed. Good morning, everybody. Very nice to have you with us and be able to see some of you. And we're longing for the day when we can all meet in person for that, but lovely to have you here now. So I'm going to start by thinking about pursuing good governance and offer you some thoughts about that. Now, governance, of course, is about the focus of trustees. the top level strategic leadership in the charity, which is what trustees are there to do. That's what governance is in essence about. It's got a number of dimensions, and quite often people concentrate, I think, on policies, systems, procedures. Now, those are all important, but they're the supporting cast, really, to the things that ultimately inform good governance. The kind of things I'm thinking about that ultimately inform good governance are the culture and also the decision-making dimensions, how trustees go about their decision-making. If they go about it in the right way, they're more likely to make good decisions. So when we're thinking about cultural and decision-making dimensions, what kind of areas might we need to have a think about with our charity? Well, the charity's culture. What's the culture within our organisation? All organisations have one, and it can be highly influential for good or for bad. I think increasingly too, we need to keep in mind ethical issues, which are of great importance to charities, and a theme which we'll come back to during the course of our time together. If you use a mission statement, think about whether you've aligned it properly to your charitable purposes. It's very easy to let the two drift apart so that it doesn't actually reflect what inherently your charity is all about. In terms of the board, thinking about the strategy of the charity, within that thinking, it will set aims and then things it's going to do and the charity is going to do. And if the charity's got the luxury of staff, the staff as well as the volunteers are going to do to pursue those aims to deliver that strategy. Well, think about how the strategic aims further those charitable purposes. And think also about the boardroom culture and positive boardroom behaviours. Maybe that you need to build on those, to encourage new people to follow those. So that's part of the charity's overall culture in many ways. And it may be in some charities there needs to be some improvement in the boardroom culture and the boardroom behaviours. Occasionally, one even has to find ways of constructively challenging negative and poor boardroom behaviours and culture. And also, what about the understandings within the charity of the trustee roles and the officer roles? What do people believe trustees are there to do and the individual officers there to do? That brings me on to the importance of having shared understandings of fundamentals. Now, this is absolutely foundational. There needs to be within the charity a shared understanding of what it is to be a charity, but also some shared understandings about the particular charity. They're the foundations of good governance. So understandings about the particular charity, well, for example, what's its legal form? There are implications of that for its governance and for the decision-making processes. So a lot of things you need to think about in terms of both the general aspect of being a charity and the aspect of, so what's special about us individually as a charity? What about the implications of that legal form and structure? Well, perhaps things need to be changed because you're not actually doing it as that legal structure wants, needs, requires. Think about the legal form of the charity, but also how is it structured? How does it operate? And what are the implications of that? Make sure you're complying with the things that are legal and regulatory requirements for both of those things, the legal form and the actual structure you've adopted. And maybe things need to be either changed because you haven't quite got it right. Maybe they need to be altered because you need to bring things up to date. Things could be quite out of date, like charitable purposes, governing documents, how the board functions, and many other things. The Charity Governance Code is important in this, and that can inform the work that's being done by a charity on this. Remember, the Charity Governance Code sets principles and then examples of good practices. And likewise, the Charity Ethical Principles, which set some principles that supplement the code and can give you a basis on which to start to address some of the ethical issues in the charity. Both really helpful. So how do we support your board conversations in this? Well, we can do all sorts of things for you. One of the things we're doing for some charities at the moment is particularly attending a number of board meetings with them to address, for example, areas of the code that are relevant to the charity. And increasingly, I think charities will turn their minds to some of the ethical challenges as well. Of course, we can provide papers, documents, comments to you on issues around governance, advice, expert comment. We can help you make change. We can help you address the cultural issues, and we can do the harder stuff change as well with you. So restructuring into a different legal form, a major exercise, but one that can be important and can be the right thing for the charity to do. Altering the governing documents, helping the board reflect and do some self-examination. For example, some of the work I'm doing at the moment helps the board with self-assessment questionnaires, reviewing trustee and officer role descriptions, introducing limited terms of office, looking at succession planning on the board, and a range of other things. Ed, thank you. Let's have the next slide. So please come and talk to us about the governance areas for your charity. We'd be delighted to help. And I guess I'm quite often engaged with that with our clients. Charity law changes. What about the direction of travel on that? Well, they have been under consideration for some time, but it's been a long, slow burn, very slow to make progress. And where we're at now is that the Law Commission made specific suggestions for change, and at last, and I choose those words advisedly, the government has finally responded. This is not a full review of charity law. It's picking on certain areas that they're targeting to make charity regulation more effective and some areas of the law easier to navigate. The government has said no to some things. You might not be too surprised to hear that one of the things it said no to is that there should be more scope for challenging the Charity Commission's decisions in front of the Charity Tribunal. But the areas where there may be change are really the ones I've highlighted here. There are some other highly technical areas, but these are perhaps the things that would matter most to many of us. A new test the Charity Commission will apply to all requests for changes of objects, changes of purposes. And that will mean that the charity and its trustees and its members, in the case of a membership charity, will have to consider certain defined matters, like the original purposes when the charity was established, as well as the current ones, and why change is necessary. Safeguards really, like the desirability of ensuring charity property is applied for charitable purposes as close as possible to the purposes you're altering, and a range of other conditions. For an unincorporated charity, there isn't at the moment a statutory power to make changes to its governing document. There are a range of ways changes can be made, but they're not always available to the charity, and there can be some complications for them. So the proposition here is that, as is the case for charitable incorporated organisations and charitable companies, there should be a clear power in an amended Charities Act to allow them to make changes to their governing document, subject to Charity Commission consent in advance for some changes, and going through the right process then to make the changes, whether or not consent was needed. Charity Commission may be given some extra powers, particularly around, for example, charity names, ordering charities to change their working name or not registering a name, taking a delay on a name where they think there might be some confusion on a name being registered, working name or proper legal name. Some changes in the procedures for disposal of charity land, including details on who can advise the trustees, because they must take advice, and what advice has to be given, what the trustees have to obtain and consider. Possible payment provisions to permit trustees subject to safeguards to be paid for supplying goods to the charity. Some provisions around what happens on failed appeals. This would potentially allow small amounts of funds raised in failed appeals to be used for similar charitable purposes without having to contact the donor. We're talking very small amounts, maybe £120, and in some cases without Charity Commission consent, a total maximum possibly of £1,000. So it's not going to allow you to run a big appeal fail on the appeal and then just redeploy the money without more legal formality. And there are other changes as well that may come, as I mentioned. Now, when and how? Well, it'll need some changes to the Charities Act. So a new, as it were, small-scale Charities Act, but highly technical, and some new regulations. The Law Commission's been told to propose a new bill, but the timetable then depends on Parliament, so we aren't certain on that yet. Final point on this, of course, remember to obey the law as it currently stands. None of this is yet law. Ed, thank you. Next slide. In the meantime, this is actually happening now. This is the Charity Commission consultation on changes to its investment guidance. That guidance is very out of date, long overdue for a complete overhaul. But at the moment, they are only doing very limited review of the areas that relate to what they're now calling responsible investments, sometimes called ethical investments. Why? Well, the Charity Commission wants to try to provide greater clarity about trustees' discretion to make responsible investments and to reassure trustees that they can usually adopt a responsible investment approach in most circumstances. That's the aims. When you look at the detail, in my view, the proposed changes are somewhat disappointing. The tone is still fairly cautious and regulatory. It's not enabling and encouraging. The draft describes responsible investments that take into account a charity's purposes and values. That seems to me to be quite weak. They should be aligned with, and wherever possible, they should further the charity's purposes and values. And it's very weak in terms of the potential, and we now know from evidence in the ethical and responsible investments area, the actual possibility of real positive impact for your charitable mission from charitable responsible investments, and make positive change by your choices on that. We know that, there's evidence of that. I was on a webinar yesterday where a really stunning example was given of a fund in which people's pension pots can be invested, where that fund is now outperforming for, I think it was nearly 10 years, comparable non-responsible funds. So getting a much better financial return, as well as the positive outcomes for society, the environment, climate change, and all the big challenges we face. And also that fund, per person that joined it, was taking the equivalent of 5 cars off the road in reducing carbon emissions. Now, how's that for a positive outcome that would align with a charity's ethics? But I don't think the Commission's been very imaginative here, and I think I'm not the only one who doesn't think that thinks they haven't been imaginative. We need to, if we want to, make a case. Think about things like climate change, the care of wildlife, human rights, employment practices, executive remuneration and rewards, the wider good of society and impacts on local communities as just some of the environmental and social governance factors that many charities would regard as really important to think about. Think about making a positive case to the Commission on this. Make your voice heard. And also remember that when we're talking about investments, very often trustees will think, well, our charity doesn't have any investments. We don't own any stocks and shares. We don't have a pooled investment fund. But investments in terms of financial investments is even the money you're holding currently on deposit. And you'll all have some of that somewhere, even in small amounts. So even an ethical choice about which bank you use, and you can certainly make ethical choices about that, those are really important to your charity and the sector as a whole, and certainly to society and all our futures on the planet. So that's a rallying call from me. You have until the 20th of May to respond on the Charity Commission website. Please do it to head us, please, to a liberating and more, dare I say, of our times approach on the part of the Commission. Ed, thank you. Could you move us on? Thank you. That was in many ways an exciting bit. Arguably less exciting is risk management. what can we say to you about risk management? Well, I think the foundation for sensible risk management, and there's an emphasis there, sensible risk management, is that foundation I talked about in some of the earlier content, knowing your organization, knowing its context. That's the foundation for sensible risk management. So your charitable purpose, keep revisiting that. It's hugely informative on so many things. And it's the fundamental commitment you have. How do you carry it out? Who do you help? Who delivers the charitable work and who operates the organisation? What factors are those things dependent on? And what would significantly affect them positively and negatively? And identify and understand different players in this picture of how your charity operates. So think, for example, about suppliers. Think about service providers. I mentioned banks a moment ago. Think about the potential negative impact if you continue to use, for example, a service provider who then is subject to a major public scandal on issues around human rights or the environment. There's been an incident with a major multinational literally over the past week where there are allegations being made about huge environmental damage. Its shares have plummeted. There are implications of risk in these areas. So think about the different players that have an impact on your risk. Suppliers, contractors, independent contractors, and so on. Recognize change and adjust where you need to. Think about the external factors that you can control or influence and those you can't. Risk is in the mix when you're thinking about changes the charity chooses to make, directions it chooses to take, but it's only in the mix. It's not the only factor. And trustees' perspective on this, well, a key outcome of the whole process of risk management is about making the charity more effective, as well as looking after everybody. The Charity Governance Code, Principle 4, encourages trustees to ensure risk assessment and risk management systems are effective. To do that, your analysis and review of risk and the decisions you make about it need to be well informed, sufficiently rigorous and timely. And of course, the board needs to recognise it has ultimate responsibility for risk management, decides the level of risk it's prepared to accept for the charity overall and on individual major risks. Managing risk is part of the good stewardship of the charity that we all share together, but that the trustees in particular have a lead responsibility for. And it's clearly an aspect of fulfilling charity trustee duties. And reporting on risk is part of your overall charity accountability. Which leads me to pass that across to Ed.
Thank you so much, Cecile. That's really helpful. What I'm going to do is just to build on that foundation of Cecile's comments on sensible risk management, and to talk to you a little bit about, some of the sort of hints and tips and practical ways in which you could go about that. To share a few thoughts about risk management myself before we talk about the future of charity accounting and reporting. I've entitled this slide "Risky Views on Risk" because I think it's so easy with risk to go down rabbit holes and to just have the wrong approach and the wrong attitude to thinking about risk. I think in particular, the words that can be so often bandied around risk are let's eliminate all risk, or let's seek to mitigate risk. And of course, those are valid words, but actually to be really clear that what we are talking about is risk management. Let me just show you a picture. The RNLI, fantastic charity, brilliant charity. Now, imagine if their approach to risk management was in fact risk elimination. In other words, they said, we are never, ever going to take any risks at all in anything we ever do. The RNLI, of course, at the very time when everybody else gets out the water, the RNLI get in the water. And actually, for them to actually achieve something, to fulfill what they're all about, the charity's purpose, as Cecile was highlighting, that they need to take risks. The important thing is, how do they manage those risks? Not how do they minimize them, how do they manage the inevitable risks that come from doing their work. Here's a little sort of fictional example of a charity and their risk policy. And you know what, it's just interesting that they clearly have a fairly good understanding of risk, and the fact that it's about managing risk and not just eliminating risk. I won't read the whole thing, but I'll just highlight particular bits. You know, the charity works with people who have been disadvantaged through limited life chances when young. It's therefore appropriate to take risks with our charity's resources to make opportunities for those people. In other words, to achieve our charitable purpose, we need to accept a level of risk with people. However, we won't take risk around the protection of young people and vulnerable adults, around safeguarding. We won't take risks around fraud and corruption. And so it's just important to have risk in that frame of mind, that it's not about just eliminating all risk, but really how do we appropriately manage it. Cecile picked up on this point as well about it being about significant impact on a charity's activities, and actually it's not just about things going wrong. It's actually about missed opportunities as well. In fact, the Charity Commission's definition of risk in CC26: uncertainty surrounding events and their outcomes that may have a significant impact, either enhancing or inhibiting an area of a charity's operations. It's so easy to think of the negative side of risk, but of course, the reality is that one of the biggest risks that charities face is not taking advantage of opportunities, or it is actually, I think a big risk for many charities is being overly risk averse, for example. So important to think about that. I think as well, what a common attitude about risk management is this: it's really important we tick the box. Let's make sure we've ticked that box so that the Charity Commission will be happy with us. You know, we've got a risk register, we're fine, we'll tick that box, and we won't let it have any impact on our actual running of our charity. That's not what risk management is supposed to be about. Risk management, bigger is better. So long as I've got a great big risk matrix that covers several spreadsheets, and it looks really impressive, then we've ticked the box and we've covered risk management. That's such a shame. Risk management is supposed to be something that actually is embedded in our organizations. And then this is slightly, speaking to our the accountants in the room and those particularly working on the finance side. It's really important. It's so easy for us to always frame risk in financial terms and as financial risks. And in reality, of course, risk management concerns a whole breadth of risk. And let's not forget about wider risks that a charity faces. Just talk to you a little bit about a common approach that many charities will take. Some risk management approaches are actually quite complicated, some are very simple, but actually this can be quite simple or can be quite complicated. But a risk register is a way quite often people would think about risks, and they would list their risks in different categories, and they'd find a way to rank them by importance. They would have some kind of response to that risk. What are we going to do about this risk? And then an action that goes with it. And particularly, there's no point in managing risk unless you're clear about who's taking a lead in managing that risk. So a risk register is a great way to think about risk. They're different levels of complexity, but it's a great approach to take. Cecile's comments are at the foundation of a risk register, identifying the key risks that a charity faces. Don't just identify the immediate threat itself. What's the underlying root cause of a threat to the organization? What's the underlying issue that's there? Not just the thing that's immediately in front of your face. As I said, remember opportunities as well as threats, and don't just think about the finance. Here's just a list for you, just to sort of, as you sort of brainstorm and think about risk, identifying risks. Here are some of the possible categories, and you'll see that financial risks are only just one of many, many risks. And so you can think about the risks of your particular charity under these headings. Just a reminder that you'll get a copy of these slides, so you'll be able to see that. Here's some helpful prompts to be thinking about. As I think about those areas of risk, a failure to, a loss of, non-compliance with, these kind of help us, they're hooks that help us to kind of identify the particular risks that the organization may face. Some great kind of idea starters there, hopefully, that will help. We talked about ranking the importance of risks, and finding a way of assessing the priority that we give to particular risks. And quite often people come up with their own scoring system. It can be quite fun and creative sometimes, or actually it could just be really simple. Some people kind of use traffic lights and colors, and it's a chance to, if you love making things look pretty, this is a great opportunity. But to actually give a score based on the likelihood of them occurring, the likelihood, or what is the magnitude of the impact should that event take place, but also an attitude to risk. How do you score this in terms of your attitude? In other words, this is something we're willing to take some risks on. This is something we're absolutely not going to take risks on. And what is some of your risk attitude there? And so that is a potential approach, and establish the action. Yeah, who is going to lead on this action? But those actions might be to say, actually, we're going to accept this risk. It's a necessary risk for us to have in our organization to enable us to be effective at what we're doing. It might be some risks you want to avoid them by doing something differently, or stopping an activity, or finding a way of not having the particular building that's a particularly risky, that presents many risks for the charity. Might be want to transfer the risk. Might be want to mitigate the risk. Of course, insurance is a key area around both of those, that you might see how do we actually see a mitigation of a risk here. But then controlling the risk. So often risks can be, if there's systems and procedures and controls in place. And so I'd encourage you to be thinking about what is your response to risks as you go through. So, that was just a quick sort of starter, I guess, to think if risk management is not something you've thought about, how might you get started? And I'd encourage you to make it real, not to make it like War and Peace, not to make it like this kind of huge, let's identify every single possible thing, but actually to zone in on the really core things. But then let's think a little bit on the responsibilities of reporting on risk in the annual accounts. And in particular, in the trustees' annual report, there is a requirement that it's mandatory for charities that have an income of greater than £500,000 a year, which is quite a few charities. For everyone else, this is best practice. We definitely, we love to see our clients do it, because I think it's great to be telling the story. But the requirement is this for those charities. The report must have a description of the principal risks and uncertainties facing the charity as identified by the trustees, together with a summary of their plans and strategies for managing those risks. In other words, don't put your entire risk register in your accounts. Don't list all your possible risks. What are the principal risks and uncertainties? And the usual approach is, 3 or 4, 5, 6, some key risks there, describing what the risks are, and then what are your plans, what are the things that you're doing, your strategies for managing those risks. Here are some examples, some real life examples, anonymous examples. Here's just a very simple approach. Trustees have identified and reviewed the major risks. The principal risks that they've identified are grants for projects being offered which were not within the objects of the charity, and a fall in the charity's investment portfolio. And then they go on to say, these are the procedures we got in place to manage those risks. Very simple, very short, meets the requirement. It's not very kind of long, not very descriptive, but it meets the requirements there. Here's another approach. This is for a PCC. The main risks and the way they're managed are this: boom, 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 going through what the risks are and then what they're doing. Again, I think very clear, very helpful to the reader of the accounts to say, yeah, these are the things that bother the trustees. These are the things that they want to be looking at. And here's another example, which I would suggest is not a good example, because really what it does is it says it's a whole load of information about how risks are managed. And we've got this wonderful spreadsheet, we've got this wonderful process where we have this policy and that policy, but we don't actually know from this what the principal risks are or what they're doing about those specific risks. So just encourage you in your reporting, be specific. Doesn't need to be, a whole load of a description about everything, but to make sure you're giving a good insight in your transparent public reporting about what the principal risks are, and then the strategies for managing those risks. And finally, before we go to questions, just a few comments on the future of charity accounting and reporting. The charity statement of recommended practice we're in a period of a little bit of stability for now. I think for the next few years, we will see the current format of charity accounts be fairly similar to the way it's been there for a couple of years. But there is a whole process now of listening and engagement and reflection around what might the next SORP look like, the charity statement of recommended practice. That word recommended is very misleading. It's really required practice. The SORP is embedded in law. If you're a larger charity or a charitable company, you do have to adopt the requirements of the charity SORP. But we're expecting this new SORP for accounting periods beginning on or after the 1st of January 2024. I just want to give you, there's a link there for you to have a little look at that really describes some of the process of this engagement over the next few years. But just to mention to you some of the themes that are coming out, there's lots of research being undertaken, lots of engagement strands and groups thinking about what are some of the key issues we need to address for the charity SORP. And some of the conclusions so far are these. The SORP is really technical and very long, and it's hard for small charities to understand. That's been my experience too, of working with smaller charities. And the reality is that the majority of charities are small. The majority of charities adopting the SORP are small charities. And so there's a huge drive at the moment for the SORP committee to say, in the next SORP, we need to think small first. So if you're a preparer of small charity accounts, this is the time when you put your celebration emoji up and you say, this is great. Wouldn't it be wonderful to see this? There's also been a lot of reflection on, do we need to declutter and reduce the length and the duplication that is in charity accounts? The accounts that I'm involved with preparing with a charity I'm a trustee of, our accounts are currently 44 pages long. That's a long document. There's a lot of stuff in there. Does a lot of that stuff actually distort some of the key messages that we need to be giving as we prepare our accounts? And I think that's a really good question to ask, and I hope that the next SORP will address that. There's, I think, a drive to make sure there's a better connection between the words and the numbers, which I think is really important. The words are really important they really tell the story, but to make sure there's not a disconnect between the words and the numbers and they work in harmony together. I think there is as well reflection that so many people view the annual accounts as a compliance exercise. We've just got to produce these accounts to meet the compliance requirements. And actually there does need to be a way in which things are structured that means that charities can use them as an opportunity to tell their story really well, to add value to the message of the charity. And I hope that we'll see that. There's talk, for example, of a one-page key facts summary. I think that's riddled with all kinds of perils, but I think that the heart behind it, I think, is a sound one, which is say, how do we make these more accessible to people? How do these really tell the story well of what the charity is doing? But there's all sorts of problems as well. You know, what's the research found is that in the public perception, the vast majority of people feel that the only expenditure a charity makes that is charitable is when they give it to a beneficiary. Now, that is a real challenge because we all know that it costs money to run charities, and we all know that there's a whole bunch of support costs and underlying costs that are all essential to pursuing our charitable purposes as charities. And so there's a real drive. How do we get an educational understanding in the public eyes and in the way that we prepare accounts that actually actually charities do spend their money on their charitable purposes on the whole. So yeah, those are some of the themes. I think it's worth just reflecting a charity finance survey, which basically did a survey of all, a selection of charities with income below £1 million. And that's many charities on the register. And it said that 71% of trustees felt that the current SORP was not fit for purpose. So I think that we are going to see some change, hopefully some development, hopefully some helpful development in the future. watch this space. We'll be one of the first to tell you about it when that change comes. But just going on in the background is this IFR for NPO project. It's International Financial Reporting for Not-for-Profit Organizations. And there's a project going on all the way around the world at the moment to see how can we have a global reporting standard, global reporting guidance that's helpful for not-for-profit organizations all the way across the world. And there's a consultation out at the moment for some of the key things that some of the key topics that need to be addressed in that, and you can read more at that website address. I think I'll just make one comment on it, and that's this, that in the UK, and I mean England and Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales, I said Wales, actually we have probably the most advanced regime of charity accounting reporting in the world and charity regulation in the world. And what I hope is that we can be at the forefront of seeing great practice across the globe. I hope that we don't kind of go backwards with this sort of globalization kind of step here, that actually we can be part of influencing great transparency and great reporting all around the world, despite the weaknesses of the sort. I hope that we can sort of take things forward into the future. So thank you so much for listening to those presentations. And what we're going to do now is take an opportunity to take some questions. And just to explain how that's going to work, there's already a couple of points and questions in the chat, which I'll take a chance to read in a minute and to share. We've also had a question in advance that we'll address. But what we're going to also try is, if you would like to ask a question in person at this event, this is how we're going to try and make that happen. So down on your menu bar at the bottom, you should have a button called Reactions. And if you hit that button, there'll be an option to raise your hand. So not this hand here, but an electronic hand. And a little hand will pop up on the screen. And what will happen is that that will bring it to our attention. And then what we'll do is we'll press a button at this end, and you'll be invited to unmute and ask your question. And we'll see how we go. We'll see how that works. But first of all, Cecile, we've had a question in advance about charity AGMs, and we've covered this in a previous event, but it's a follow-up to that. What actual words need to be added to a charity's articles in the AGM section to enable virtual and hybrid AGMs to continue in the years to come?
Thank you, Ed. It is, I'm afraid, not so simple as to say, here's a few words, put them in and it'll be okay. Firstly, you have to think about what legal form of charity it is. There was a clue in that question. They said articles, that means it's a company. There would be some differences between the different legal forms of charity, potentially. It depends what's in the current constitution. And also there's a range of areas that are both legal and practical difficulties that remain unresolved on hybrid and virtual meetings usually. And again, definitions, there's no strict legal definitions, so be very careful that you're clear what people are talking about. Virtual meetings, they mean where everybody is online, as we are now. Hybrid, they mean some people are together in one place and some are joining at a distance. There's all sorts of challenges about that, including how you can deal with it in the Constitution. Another factor has to be, what does the current Constitution say, and other factors. So that's an answer that says it's very situation specific. You absolutely need to be clear about the charity's current situation, take some advice, get some help. Obviously, it's one of the things we can and do help people with, and it isn't that simple necessarily.
Thank you, Cecile. Thank you, Emma, for your comments in the chat. That I think everyone's learned in the pandemic that they need to have the pandemic in their risk registers going forward. That it's quite easy to have a general risk register with general risks, but actually, of course, the pandemic brings about whole fresh challenges, and that's absolutely right. There's a real need for people to think about some of the particular risks that arise from the pandemic, and of course, a lot of those are long-term risks. They're ones that will stick with us for quite some time. And I think what it highlights as well is the need to be really active and proactive when it comes to risk. That so often we see risk management, sadly, as once a year we'll do this exercise, then we'll put it in a drawer. but actually it's a living document, something that is perhaps revisited, not just perhaps even at every meeting, but actually embedded in the work that perhaps if you're a larger charity, the management are involved in that process. So thank you for that helpful comment. And then a comment from Derek that their insurers at the church have sent a questionnaire asking about all kinds of risk assessments, and not just kind of the usual stuff, but actually a whole load of things about risk, and just the fact that it's quite a demanding thing. It causes a lot of problems having to pull that information together. And I quite agree. As a kind of a voluntary church leader and treasurer, it's hard to find the time for all those kind of things. And of course, that what's behind it, of course, is a risk mindset from the part of the insurers. That actually, in their mind, what they're thinking is, if we are working with an organization that is proactively managing risks and has risk assessments in place, because what a risk assessment, of course, is an identification of the key risks, and then how are we going to address those risks and control them? And in their view, if those risk assessments exist, then here we're dealing with an organization which is less likely to have a loss that they didn't foresee, or a loss that wouldn't have actually been controlled or mitigated or managed in some way. But of course, sometimes what asking for these things does is encourage a bit of a box ticking mentality. Let's get a bit of paper in place that shows our insurers that we manage risk. I sympathise with the comment. It is kind of the world we're living in, isn't it? Really, I think. Cecile, I don't know whether you want to add any comments to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple really. One is, and this is not obviously situation specific to the situation that Derek finds himself in, but do think about your insurance source and whether it actually has the sense to realise you're a charity and probably quite a modest-sized organisation. A lot of trustees never review their insurance sources, so I think about that. And I think one of the comments you made, Ed, which was about going behind the exact risk to the reasons behind it, where is the real threat? Actually, economic collapse worldwide would be a disastrous threat to all of us. So the reason behind actually is a fundamentally good one in that example. And some of the other examples in the question are about specific events, a fire or an incident in a children's club. And so I think that process you described about go behind it to where are the major sources of risk, as well as any specifics that we must individually address, is a helpful way of approaching it.
Thank you. Peter, thank you for raising your hand. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question? Yes. Hi.
Okay. Yeah. My question isn't specifically about any of the items that you've actually presented today. It's more about the roles, your particular role, and Cecilia's role at Burton Sweet, because we're a very small charity, and we're just coming up to a situation where we're going to have to take quite large investment decisions, having some land that we've sold for housing development. And we need to invest that money, and how best to approach that. So we've generally dealt with Nigel Harris at Burton Sweet. So I'd like to know what your roles were within Burton Sweet's organisation. Are you accountants or are you advisors? Can we come to you for advice on operational matters rather than accounting matters? Is that the sort of, that's what I'd like to know about your roles, really.
Thanks so much, Peter. Those kind of questions are extremely welcome, because it gives us an opportunity to talk about what we do, and particularly what we can offer. As Burton Sweet, we do offer a very wide range of services to charities, and I think very much what we see ourselves as, and what many clients see us as, is really the kind of first port of call where there is a challenge around charity governance, or a decision to be made, or perhaps it is to do with finance, it's to do with annual accounts, it's to do with an audit or an independent examination, or it's to do with the setting up of trading activities, or it's to do with how can we ensure that we're complying with our constitution? It's to do with, actually, it's things like investment decisions. I think the important thing to say about investment decisions is that we are not investment advisors, and also we're not authorized to give you investment advice about the best place. However, with every area of charity, running a charity, we always know people that do. And in fact, there's a couple of people on the call on the meeting today who actually do have that role as charity investment advisors. So our encouragement to you always is to have the conversation with us, to get in touch, to say that you're facing a challenge, for us to have that discussion with you. And where we need to get someone else involved to help, we can give you some options of some people you can talk to get that help, and we'd be delighted to do that. Hopefully that's clear, Peter. Cecile, I don't know whether you want to add anything more to that.
Yeah, just a bit of a couple of things, Peter. Thank you, lovely question. Ed's an accountant, and he knows everything there is to know about charity finances, charity practical management of their finances, and being a trustee. I'm not an accountant. I know numbers are necessary, and accounting and reporting's important, but I'm a lawyer. And what I understand is how law and regulation impacts on charities, and how governance impacts on them for good or for bad. So the kind of things I'm advising trustees on are those sorts of areas. So in your investment example, I'd be happy to give you some help about what is the law what does the law require of us trustees? What's the framework in which we're to make these investment decisions? And are there any particular rules we must follow? For example, certain legal types of charity, trustees have to do very particular things on investments. They are by law obliged to. And, if you've not had to make substantive investment decisions before, you might not be aware of that. So I hope that's a useful example. So I do the legal regulatory governance. Ed's the expert more around the financial management. And we both have experience of being trustees, so we absolutely know what it's like trying to manage these things in practice.
Can I follow that up by, are you inviting us to contact you directly rather than go through the standard channels that our relationship with Burton Sweet have developed over the last few years? Yeah.
Either would be fine. Do go through your usual channels, and they'll put you in touch with us. Just mention that. But we'll send you a mailing after this event, which will then have an opportunity, if you would like to, have our contact details on for you to be able to contact us directly. Either, and of course that accounts for everybody else on the call too. But thanks so much for your question. Would anybody else like to take an opportunity, either in the chat or to raise your electronic hand? And I'm just going to ask Paul now to unmute and to ask a question.
Thank you. This is a governance question. I'm not sure whether there's a complete right or wrong answer, but just in terms of trustee recruitment and the process of trustee recruitment, is there best practice in terms of whether trustees should start initial conversations, or whether exec teams should start initial conversations? In the past, we've kind of done it both ways, and I'm just wondering whether that is the right approach.
And you're thinking, Paul, of individual conversations with particular individuals who might be trustees, become trustees?
Yeah, so there are two areas that we've identified. So the process now will be packs and process, etc. And it's when you're requesting that initial, I guess, statement of interest, who should be the right person. I mean, to some extent, I want to make sure that there's neutrality in that conversation, but I also understand the importance of an executive team, in an area of public health or education, being able to be very clear about what's the expectation of that individual.
Well, I think my start point would be that the board does need to drive the overall process of trustee recruitment and succession planning. And it's vitally important the board is driving that, not the executive. The executive's got an important part to feed into it. But if the board does what it should, which is look on a regular basis at what have we got, what do we need, what are we going to need, skills, aptitudes, life experience being good examples, and has a clear position, not just we've got X number of vacancies, but these are the things we need and this is why. The executive can feed into that process at the board's invitation and sometimes be very helpful on that, but the board should set those parameters, and then in the process, I think that the depending on what routes you use to seek people, and there's a variety of routes you can use, and I'm thinking we've got an information sheet about recruitment of trustees that could be useful to you. It talks about routes to advertise vacancies, but it might set up thoughts in your head about how you get those approaches. If there's particular individuals you want to talk to, I think it's a matter of the board deciding who's appropriate to make an approach. If you're going to do public advertising, even in a controlled way, I think there should be one key point of contact for that individual to get the information pack and so on. But for conversations with individuals, I think you do need to, apart from perhaps an initial inquiry type conversation, make sure there's a trustee involved in that, usually the chair, but could be one of the other trustees, could be two trustees. If there's someone who does a governance role on the board, they can be quite useful in that conversation. So I think what I'm saying is it does need to be trustee driven, and people need to be clear that it's following a process to obtain the results that the board's identified. These are what we need. Does that help a bit?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. I think we have time for one more question. Now, if you can't find your electronic hand, please feel very free to use your actual hand to wave at me, and I'll invite you to unmute and ask a question if you'd like to. Scanning around, it's great to see people's faces. Lovely. Well, I think we've covered it, Cecile. That's all good, isn't it? So just remains to say thank you so much for being with us today. We hope that you found the event enjoyable. We'll send very shortly an email out that actually asks you for your feedback from the event today, including giving you an opportunity to make suggestions of content that we could cover in our future events. Also then what will follow after that a couple of days later is this copy of the slides and also a copy of the recording, so you can revisit any elements that you want to listen to again. But for now, thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Have a good lunch if you haven't had it already, and we hope to see you really soon. Thanks. Bye for now.